I don't really trust the authorities. Anyone watching any of my content for any length of period of time, I think that would be a general statement that you'd get pretty quickly. I don't really trust them, and I think that history is a good lesson to not trust those in those governmental positions of authority. There's a quote, I can't remember who the quote is from right now, but it says if you trust your government, you haven't learned from history or you don't know history or something to that effect. And I think that is true. But still, many times, as I was saying in one of the contemplations, I find myself nearly seemingly on the defending side of some of the authorities because sometimes the way how we criticize them and the types of critiques that we have don't actually work to benefit anyone. And they kind of falter when you look at them with a logical mind. They aren't always holding up to that ideal of logic. And in particular, when we're talking about the COVID issues and the pandemic issues and even the issues with the jab that seems to be arising more and more now with the hesitancy, and different people now are trying to get their own quadrants to go out and get the jab, go get vaccinated, get inoculated. And many different people who may have been singing a slightly different tune before are trying now to change that tune to get their people who may listen to them to be more quick on the inoculations and the vaccinations. Now, I have some problems and some critiques about how sometimes they're going about getting people to influencing people to get the jab. But I understand why it's being done. And I think that some people misunderstand that the what is at risk when we're dealing with the events of this pandemic and the different aspects of it. What's at risk isn't just the health of a nation and the health of the world, everyone together, humanity and the pandemic, the effect of the pandemic, the long lasting effects. That's not just the only thing at risk here. When you're looking in countries like Switzerland, France, Italy, many of those countries that may have been considered very well developed, far in the developmental line, when you look at them and the results some of them are having with the effects of this pandemic, they're having a de-evolution of society in some places. The protests are getting kind of crazy, and with the protests, you have the increased effect of the virus also. So the protest doesn't pause the virus. I remember looking over in the US last year when all the protests were going on, and their protests have and nearly everything in the US has a very strong political slant to it. And when one side was protesting, you'd see the doctors on that side literally say that these protesters cannot spread the virus. Nonsense like that is what made people distrust the medical staff in some things with this pandemic. But we know that these crowds are unwise, and the protests are happening because of some of the actions that are being taken. So on the government side, when you're looking at the people in authority and the decisions they make, the words they say, the effect that is happening isn't just a matter of health and national health. The effect is on the entire stability of our society. We are risking societal stability when we play with these things. This is a new thing. Nearly no one who is alive right now would have lived through anything even close to what we are living through right now with this pandemic. And if you play around with some of these new things that are now being done, we do not know what may be the result of some, and we may not know how society may hold up with some of these different things. And we're seeing, as I said before, France is having protests. The protests in France have trickled down to Martinique, and we're seeing a severe result of this. And in Trinidad here, we're seeing now that our politicians on both sides of the aisles seem to now be trying to settle themselves into a very pro-vaccine stance and a very pro-national stance, probably distancing themselves from some more foolish things that were said previously. UNC PNM call on citizens to get vaccinated. As usual, if you haven't clicked that like button yet, don't forget to click that like button. I know many of you may not even be watching right now, you may be listening at a distance, but you can take that little time and find it in your fingers to tap on that like button And drop a comment if you have something to say. And if you aren't subscribed yet, I'll be seriously shocked that you're listening and aren't subscribed yet. So please do click that subscribe button. Get on board. Whether people get vaccinated or not is their personal business. But if TNT has to get out of its current hole and vaccinations are the ticket, then Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley needs to lead the public with encouragement by talking to people, not at them, United National Congress Deputy Leader Jolene John opined yesterday. To start off, I totally agree with that. Talk to people and not at them. Opposition MP Dr. Rudal Munilal also accused Rowley and his government of promoting vaccine hesitancy. Well, that's an accusation. John was responding when asked whether she'd taken a COVID vaccine and what advice the UNC was giving supporters on this. John reiterated that the UNC had been urging the public to get vaccinated for months. Apart from many UNC supporters taking the vaccine in TNT, Guardian Media also independently confirmed that some were unable to get vaccines since April, despite going to several health centers, eventually went overseas and obtained the Pfizer vaccines in the US. So, you were unable to access the vaccines in Trinidad, but you found it easier to get a flight to the US to get a vaccine over there, and then the process to get a flight back. I am happy, if we're saying that vaccines are the way out, then I'm happy that the people got the preferred vaccine that they wanted. But to make it seem like the total reason that you went to Florida to get the Pfizer vaccine was only because it was unavailable down here, I'm not sure I buy that totally, because especially as of right, I know earlier on there was a bit of holdback in the vaccine rollout, but within the last month or so, the vaccines have been rolling out very quickly. But okay, some UNC members also went away to get their vaccines. John said people will have their personal reasons to get vaccinated, as well as not get vaccinated. But if TNT is following the science, and this is what the science dictates, then people need to get vaccinated. But she said, at the same time, Rowley and his government could not simply dismiss religious, medical, cultural, or other grounds people may also have. You are the leader. You have to be willing to hear people, find out why, and you have to encourage people to take their vaccines. People are looking for leadership. You have to talk to the people, not at them. And you have to be sincere. Come off your high horse, buffing people and talking about who you block and who not. I suppose that's a plug back at Rowley's comments from last weekend when he spoke about having to block one of the opposition members. And as with many of his speeches, that became its own memeable moment. But I understand it to some extent what he was speaking about. But I've said that before. That's a criticism that I have continuing on Dr. Rowley, that he often allows himself to get a bit carried away in the speaking, and as a leader, as the point we're talking about right now, as a leader, you have to be really careful of the words that you choose, because people are listening to you, and some people take what you say very seriously, and it may be easier to change their mind in the initial of what you say than to correct that changed mind when you have already said what you have said. So, okay, that's understandable. This isn't an easy time for TNT. But this is the time for the Prime Minister to be his brother's keeper and to be a leader he says he is. People voted for his party twice. Stand up for them properly now and sound like it. Monilal, who got his vaccine on April 24th, said he's repeatedly called on constituents to take the vaccine. Any vaccine, stay alive, even if you don't like the vaccine. But government's attitude is promoting vaccine hesitancy, he said. Now, I will not take that from Dr. Munilal, because he was one earlier also accused of promoting that same vaccine hesitancy. Dr. Munilal was the same one who spoke of the Trinidadian citizens being guinea pigs with the Sinopharm when it was announced that we were going to get the Sinopharm vaccine. He was the same one who said that he doesn't want the Trinidadians to be guinea pigs where we're being tested, where this Sinopharm vaccine is only being tested on us, this experimental Chinese vaccine. So he himself would have influenced some of this vaccine hesitancy that he is speaking about now, and he may be trying to backtrack on that, but he himself has some consequence to bear on it also. Asked about whether the entire cabinet had been vaccinated yesterday, Communications Minister Simon de Nabriga said, "I cannot think of anyone from the government side in Parliament that wasn't vaccinated." As with most cases, I don't really buy the opposition's genuine concern about the situation and the hesitancy, because they were irresponsible in some of their statements before also. But in the context where they are speaking about it being important to speak to people instead of at them, I am fully in support of that. And that's what I've been saying over and over and over again. You see, what we need to do, if you're saying that vaccination is the way out, what we need to do is convince people. If you're saying that the vaccines are going to kill us all, then even you, what you need to do is convince people. If you believe that the vaccines aren't the way, I wonder if saying that on YouTube is going to trigger some algorithm. I'm saying what some people say. This isn't what I necessarily believe, but if you believe that these jabs are going to do us real harm, then shouldn't your job also be to convince people of this opinion? And that's the difficulty, convincing people. You see, if you don't convince people, the next option is to force them. And the problem with force may work in some contexts, but to do force, for one, you have to have either people that are willing enough to allow you to perpetrate this force over them and they go along with it. Or you need to have people that are disarmed and weak enough that your force would be so much stronger than them. But generally the way it goes is the population, generally speaking, has the numbers on their side. And if you do not then convince them of what you have, you're going to find yourself in a position where you come up against the population in a force meets force kind of battle. Martinique hit by new protests over COVID-19 regulations. The French Caribbean territory of Martinique, already burdened with the pressure of coping with the fourth COVID-19 wave, has witnessed new demonstrations against measures imposed by the authorities to address a worrying surge in cases of the potentially deadly virus. Citizens took to the street on Saturday in a demonstration organized by trade unions and other local groups to denounce the imposition of a health pass and compulsory vaccinations for certain professions, including healthcare workers. "My body, my choice," read some placards carried by the crowd in the capital, Fort de France. Trade unionist Serge Aribo, one of the organizers, was quoted by Martinique France Antilles as saying that the matter of the effectiveness of the vaccines was not the issue, but the fact that the vaccines are being forced on individuals. For us, it is a question of reminding us today of the fundamental principles which are written everywhere in international agreements. Human rights must be respected. We cannot introduce a product into the body of a man or a woman without his prior agreement, Aribo declared. The latest Martinique protest took place as new measures to control the spread of COVID-19 went into force. Overwhelmed by the COVID-19 spike, which has seen the number of positive cases rise from 2,200 last week to 3,500 cases, Martinique's University Hospital Saturday began transferring some patients to France, while the French government has announced plans to send soldiers to assist the hospital to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. Now, soldiers to assist the hospital sounds a bit fishy to me. I would have thought doctors to assist the hospital. Soldiers to assist the hospital sounds more like soldiers to assist with the protest, but I guess we will see what would happen if and when France does send these troops to Martinique. Now, what wasn't mentioned in this article is that the protests have one aspect during the day, as many protests, if you look at many of these styles of very large protests, there's one protest that happens during the day where they outline clearly their politically correct message, as it were. They are protesting peacefully, this is what they want, but oftentimes the atmosphere created by a very large protest could leave space for some level of violence and misbehavior, especially when darkness sets in after the protest. And that happened also in Martinique. Shots fired, police officers injured during overnight violence in Martinique. At least 5 police officers sustained injuries in clashes with rioters in Martinique overnight, local reports say. According to local media, rioters fired at the police, set buildings and cars on fire, blocked roadways and looted businesses between 9:50 p.m. Saturday and about 2 a.m. on Sunday. The communities of Saint-Thérèse and Canal Alaric in Fort-de-France experienced the worst of the violence, to which police responded with tear gas. Reports say the overnight unrest came after the conclusion of the mass protest on Saturday, organized by trade unions and other groups, to denounce the imposition of the health pass, and we know that already. So these protests that happened during the day paved the way for some of the heightened violence in the night, and maybe the Soles may be coming to help with some of that. But what we must be looking at as Trinidad, we don't have any of that, at least not yet, and I really do hope that we'll never reach there. But if, for example, if the vaccine hesitancy continues holding out at the levels that they currently are at, what are the next steps that are going to be taken? In Trinidad, I think we have, it may be a benefit, it may be a disadvantage, according to how you look at it. We have the benefit or disadvantage of having a very strong economy and a lot of people being very tied into this capitalism work style, free market, well, not very free, but more capitalist, money flowing kind of economy. So people can be influenced more easily by their jobs. And we're seeing this in Trinidad. A lot of the leading push, I think, in getting people vaccinated is this kind of not mandatory but mandatory vaccination push and drive that we are seeing from many of the businessmen and many of the business owners. And this is coming partly from the top. One of the restaurant owners was speaking that one of the reasons they pushed that policy was also because they're hearing it strongly suggested from the government, from the Prime Minister, that unless the vaccination numbers rise, the industries may not open. So there's that push from the business side, and I think that may allow for there to be less kickback against it, because if your job says something, it's either you do the job or you don't do the job. It's still up to you. There's still that freedom. But when the mandates start coming from the government, if they start coming from the government, what would Trinidad look like? What would our reaction be like in Trinidad if that does happen, if it does reach to that? And bear in mind, even if you're an adult and you could be convinced to take the vaccine for your work and you get over some of your own fears, remember there's a possibility that there may be this same emergency use vaccine that seems to be clouded in mystery to some people. There's a chance that this vaccine could become mandatory for children. In Antigua, they're already talking about this, and they're receiving some obvious pushback from the parents. What is going to happen if a government attempts to make this same vaccine mandatory for children? And I think that a sensible society would attempt to have these discussions and have these difficult discussions and interactions before they reach the point where they're critical, where the decisions must be made at a split-second notice. I think the discussions before would stand a chance of us avoiding what we're seeing in Martinique, what we're seeing in France, what we're seeing in Switzerland, what we're seeing in Italy, what we're seeing in Australia also. So maybe the discussion should be had now. What do you think? Let's have this discussion if you think so. Drop a comment in the comments, and I'll see you again tomorrow for the next.
And you feel the music rising with the time.